Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We are back to talk about return to work by popular demand. This is actually one of our most requested topics, so we thought we would bring this information to you again and discuss some traditional return to work methods, as well as remind you about some alternative avenues you can take to actually help your employees and mitigate your claims costs while you're at it. So thanks again for joining us today. As many of you know, Amerisure is one of the nation's leading providers of commercial insurance. We specialize in managing risk for businesses in construction, in manufacturing, and in healthcare, and we're licensed to conduct business in all 50 states. We've been in business for over 100 years, so I think that speaks a lot to what we bring to you as our policyholders and our agents, and we're happy to have you as part of our partnerships. There are nearly 700 Amerisure employees with our headquarters located in Farmington Hills, Michigan, and we have 12 strategically located core service centers around the country. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type them into that little Q&A box or in the Zoom chat. You do have an option to submit your questions anonymously if you choose, and then we're going to bring up all the questions at the end of our presentation. Due to the number of attendees and to avoid any background interference, all attendees are muted and will remain muted for the duration of this webinar. And then just please be aware that this webinar is for general information only. It's not intended to provide specific solutions for any potentially unsafe conditions, should not be relied upon for legal advice. You are advised to consult with an attorney to address any particular circumstance you might have, and Amerisure assumes no duty or obligation to any party in providing this information to you today. Okay, so let's get to our presenters. Today we have Blake Beckman and Lacey Sacco. So Blake's been a part of the Amerisure team since 2021. He's currently based in our Dallas Core Service Center. Many of you might know him out of Oklahoma if you've had the chance to meet him. He has a bachelor's degree in fire protection and safety engineering and a master's degree in occupational safety and health. Blake has worked as a field safety coordinator for a construction company prior to joining Amerisure. Lacey is returning to reprise her role in helping you understand more about the benefits of return to work. She's been a part of the Amerisure team since 2020. She's currently based in our Chicago Core Service Center. Prior to joining our claims experience organization, she had over 10 years of experience handling complex workers' compensation claims in 12 different jurisdictions. So a lot of experience here to go over the return to work topic with you today. But before we dive in, we want to throw out a little poll for you. So this is little 3 questions that we'd like to answer just so we can get an idea of who's out there and who's joining us today. So give me 1 second and I will get this launched for you. And here we go. So question number 1, did you attend our previous return to work webinar? And question number 2, if you attended, which return to work programs did you implement after, if any? And question number 3, if you're new here today with us and you didn't get a chance to attend last time, do you currently have a formalized light duty return to work program? I'll give you all just a little bit of time to read those through and submit your questions. About another 15 seconds. Okay, and let's see what we've got. All right, so it looks like we have a good portion of you that didn't return. For the ones that did return, or that are returning, thank you so much. We've got some new information to share. If you attended last time, which return to work programs did you implement after? So a formalized return to work program, perfect. That's one of the main things that we really want to get implemented out there. So I'm glad that worked out for you. And then we have some that said none, still not sure how to do this. That's why you're here today. So I'm glad we're able to share this with you. And if you're new here, do you currently have a formalized light duty return to work program? So many of you said yes, some of you still said no. Well, you're in the right place. So thanks so much. All right. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and flip this over to Blake, and he's going to get us started today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Anjali. So if you take a look at your screen, you'll be able to see the topics that we'll be covering today. We're going to discuss the importance of light duty return to work and the benefits of light duty return to work for both the employer and for the employee. We'll also go over a few case studies, and we're going to review some actual claim data, and then we'll talk about traditional light duty return to work programs, including some of the obstacles that employers encounter, as well as alternatives to a traditional return to work program. This webinar series is focused on risk management strategies. The primary goals of a risk management program are designed to prevent accidents or injuries from ever happening. Some of the primary ways that we accomplish these goals are through general safety and risk transfer programs. Light duty return to work requires both pre-accident as well as post-accident strategies. An effective light duty return to work program first needs to be developed, formalized, and supported by management so that if an injury does occur, you're ready to implement it. This is where your risk management and claims programs will intersect. Collaboration is going to be key for your light duty program to be effective. As you can see in this diagram, your risk management and claims programs should be interconnected in order to ensure successful outcomes. Today, we're going to talk about why a return to work program is so important, not only in terms of risk management and loss prevention, but also to your claims handling process. A collaborative approach between these disciplines will ensure the most successful outcomes. So first, let's quickly define light duty. Now, it may sound simple enough, but there are actually different types of light duty accommodation. The first one you see here is modified work. This is when an employer brings an injured employee with work restrictions back to their original job, but modifies that job so that the physical demands are within their restrictions. An example of modified work could be a machine operator who suffered a back strain and has lifting restrictions. His normal job may require him to lift materials as well as operate the machine. So his employer could bring him back to his normal job as a machine operator, but provide him with a trainee or helper to perform the lifting task. Transitional work is when an employer finds temporary work in another job that is within their work restrictions. Now, this type of work can be inside or outside of the organization, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Alternative work is simply finding a new job for the employee within the company that will accommodate physical restrictions. An example may be reassigning an experienced field superintendent who has been given work restrictions to a new job in the office that can best utilize his skills and experience, but will also accommodate any physical limitations. So let's talk about why light duty return to work is so important. Here are a couple of quick statistics. You may have heard this before, but data shows that the longer an injured worker is out of work, the less likely it is that they will ever return to work at full duty. So as each day passes and your employee is at home instead of at work, the chances of them ever returning to employment progressively goes down. The numbers show that if an injured worker is out of work for 6 months, the probability that they will ever return to full duty work is only 55.4%. After 2 years of an employee being out of work, this number goes down to a staggering 4.9%. As you can see, the sooner we can get injured workers back to work, the better. In 2019, there was a study completed that showed that return to work is a key component for an injured worker having a positive workers' comp claims experience. Satisfaction with the overall claims process can have a big impact on claims costs, such as reduced litigation costs and ultimately returning the injured worker to their normal job and pay sooner, which will result in closing the claim faster. There are many benefits to implementing an effective return to work program for both the injured worker and for their employer. So let's go ahead and review some of these. When an employer is able to bring an injured employee back to some kind of light duty work, there are several immediate benefits to that employee. And we all know how important it is to take care of our employees, particularly in a tough labor market. First, when an employee returns to work instead of sitting at home, it will improve their self-esteem by helping them remain productive and active. This will also contribute to a faster recovery because the injured worker will be more motivated to return to their normal routines. Bringing an injured worker back to work will also provide a better sense of job security. In my experience in talking with injured workers, one of the primary reasons that they retain legal counsel is not knowing if they have job security going forward. Lastly, just a simple routine of interacting with your coworkers and being able to socialize can drastically improve an injured worker's morale. I think most of us can relate to this, especially when you think about what we all went through in 2020 with COVID. At a certain point, after being trapped at home for a while, I don't know about you, but I was craving interaction with friends and other adults. There are also a lot of benefits to the employer, besides having an engaged, happy employee. First, bringing your injured employees back to work will reduce medical costs as well as indemnity benefits. This reduces the ultimate cost of the claim and will have a positive impact on your loss experience and ultimately your insurance premiums. When employees return to light duty work, it will reduce the chances of attorney involvement as well as reduce the chance of fraudulent behavior. Also, productivity is increased and it improves the overall morale of your employees and so improves the employee's relationship with their employer. So what we're looking at now on our screen, this is the classic iceberg model. This is one of my favorite graphics because it shows us what we're easily able to identify versus what may be difficult to see. We're all very aware of direct costs as we can see those on a financial ledger, but those are just the tip of the iceberg. There are many hidden costs that are sometimes even difficult to quantify. We've already talked about some of these when going over the benefits of a return to work program. Reducing direct costs such as medical costs and lost time benefits on a workers' comp claim is important and it has an impact. But the indirect cost or hidden costs of accidents is where a light duty return to work program can really help. If an injured employee is out of work, you've already lost one good employee and the claim costs may be piling up. The injured employee may be feeling the negative economic effects of being on workers' comp benefits as well. Aside from that, you may have to hire and train a new employee to fill in for that injured worker. Hiring new employees isn't cheap. It costs time and money for management to train a new employee. In some cases, the employer may have to ask other employees to pick up the slack, which could lead to a loss of overall production or mistakes being made. Asking your employees to take on more workload can possibly cause more injuries if the employees who are covering for the injured worker have to rush through additional job tasks or if they're not as familiar with the new job duties, all things that can seriously impact companies' profitability. So be aware, these hidden costs can oftentimes have a much bigger financial impact than the direct costs. Okay, so we've reviewed a lot of the direct and indirect benefits of a light duty return to work program. We've mentioned that an effective program can ultimately impact the company's loss experience and ultimately their premiums. Let's get into that in a little more detail. In most states, your EMR or experience modification rate, some of you may know it as your EMOD, determines your workers' compensation premiums. If you have poor loss experience, this is reflected in your EMR and your workers' comp premiums will increase. Conversely, if you have really good loss experience, your workers' comp premiums will go down. So besides the direct cost to a claim, the medical bills and lost time costs, how does light duty return to work impact loss experience and premiums? Again, in most states, if an employer is able to bring an injured employee back to work within the statutory waiting period and avoid the claim from ever becoming a lost time claim, so keeping the claim medical only, the total value of the claim is reduced by 70% when calculating the EMR. I say most states because there are several states that do not employ this method or don't utilize the entities that establish and maintain EMRs. If you don't know if you're in one of those states or you're just curious, please feel free to consult with your agent to see how your EMR is calculated and impacted. And on this slide, we can see an illustration that is based off of a real example. Every employer's goal is to have an EMR of 1.0 or lower. 1.0 is what you can think of as the industry average of all of your peers in your respective field. So electrical contractors are compared to other electrical contractors and so on. In this example, the company on the left did not have a light duty return to work program. Over the course of several years, their EMR rose to a 1.46, which means that they're paying almost 50% more in workers' compensation premium than their peers or competitors. When we reran the numbers, taking out all of those temporary partial lost time payments, basically removing the claim costs associated with paying lost wages to employees who were on light duty restrictions but were not brought back to work. It showed that had this employer had a light duty return to work program, and if they were using it effectively, their EMR could have been reduced to a 0.94, which means that they'd be paying less workers' comp premiums than their peers. This difference in premiums can prove to be a huge competitive edge when determining customer pricing. Also, in many industries, if you have an EMR over a 1.0, you may not be able to bid on or win the same jobs you could if you had an EMR of 1 or less.
All right, so let's go over some real life examples. All right, so let's first look at a construction example. This claim was for a 42-year-old roofer who was unloading a truck when loose scaffolding fell onto his head and shoulder, resulting in a concussion and a rotator cuff tear. He has an average weekly wage of $800, which equates to a weekly compensation rate of $489.22. It could take up to 3 years before he is released to full duty. So if restrictions cannot be accommodated, we can expect to pay over $25,000 in lost time benefits. We can assume the medical cost of $60,000 would be the same whether or not light duty is available. So if the employer can accommodate some kind of light duty work at the pre-injury wages, the employer's EMR would go from a 0.79 to a 0.80. If the employer cannot accommodate light duty work, the EMR would go all the way up to a 0.89. Our second case study is a manufacturing example. This claim involved a 42-year-old production worker who was working on a die press when the steel plate he was working on slipped out of his hands and struck his ankle, causing a fracture. This type of injury can easily result in some kind of physical work restrictions for up to 2 years. And based on his average weekly wage and compensation rate, that equates to over $16,000 each year in lost time benefits. If the employer was able to accommodate restrictions at the pre-injury wage, the employer can expect their EMR to go from a 0.85 to a 0.86. If the employer was not able to accommodate the restrictions and TTD was owed, their EMR would climb to a 0.92. So let's look at a healthcare example. Here we have a 25-year-old CNA who was transferring a patient from a wheelchair to the bed, causing back pain. She was diagnosed with a lumbar disc herniation. Similar to the 2 prior examples, if the employer was able to accommodate the lifting restrictions, they could potentially keep their EMR at a 0.95, but without a light duty return to work, their EMR would grow to a 1.0. So let's look at some claims side by side. Here we have claim number 1, which involved a minor injury that did not require surgery. The doctor released the worker to light duty, but the employer did not have a return to work program. So in this case, the employer waited until the employee was released to full duty before allowing them to return. And without a return to work program in place, lost time benefits of $4,600, about $4,600 would be owed. Keep in mind, as Blake mentioned earlier, in most states, if there are no indemnity payments, the medical costs here of $3,377 is reduced by another 70% when calculating the EMR. In claim number 2, this was an injury that did require surgery. And the 22 weeks of lost time were due to the doctor's recommendation to stay off of work completely. However, if the employer had been able to accommodate the restrictions once the employee was released to light duty at 22 weeks, they could have avoided another 27 weeks of benefits from being paid on this claim, or about $20,000 from their mod. Now let's look at one more side-by-side example. This is actually a recent example with 2 very similar circumstances, except for one major difference. Both of these claims involved shoulder surgeries for construction workers who were earning similar wages in the same jurisdiction. Both of these workers were taken off of work for about 12 weeks following the surgery, which is not unusual for a rotator cuff repair. And it took both workers a total of 56 weeks to be released without restrictions. The main difference between these two claims, well, you've probably guessed it by now. Employer number one had collaborated with Amerisure's risk management team to implement a comprehensive return to work program and accommodated restrictions whenever possible. Employer two sadly did not do those things. There's one other small difference, which is that while employer one accommodated restrictions whenever possible, they could not always pay the pre-injury wages. So there were about 10 weeks where the injured worker received a partial payment from both Amerisure and their employer. And we'll talk about this more in a few slides, but ultimately these temporary partial disability payments are always less than the full TTD exposure and still result in indemnity savings on the claim. Had employer one not accommodated any restrictions, almost $63,000 would have been issued in indemnity benefits from the claim. This employer was able to save over $47,000 from their total incurred by accommodating those restrictions. Employer two could have prevented up to $55,000 from their total incurred had restrictions been accommodated. So now that we've looked at those examples, let's look at what a traditional return to work program looks like. So first, let's look at some proactive approaches that you can take to mitigate indemnity before an injury even occurs. Consistency is critical when formulating your return to work program. Designating someone to implement and oversee the program can make a significant difference. You might be surprised at just how effective it can be to allocate resources for your safety program. For example, I once worked with an insured who had been using their only HR person to try and manage their claims. And this account was simply too large for one person to handle all of those responsibilities effectively. And their loss ratio reflected that. They worked with Amerisure's risk management team and just prior to their renewal, officially designated someone to manage their work comp program. In the policy period just prior to this change, they had a total of 65 workers' compensation claims. In their first policy year after making this change, they only had 21 workers' compensation claims, almost all of which remained medical only. This account was able to reduce their MOD from a 1.41 to a 0.83 in just about a year and a half after implementing this change. Another way to ensure consistency is to make sure that the employees and new hires are well informed of the expectations before an injury occurs. Ensuring that they know what to do before an injury occurs reduces the uncertainty for the employee once an injury does occur. And as many of you know, uncertainty about the claims process can often lead to litigation. Additionally, drafting detailed physical job descriptions for all full duty positions or even modified duty positions within your company ahead of time can help reduce the life of the claim. Adjusters will often send these physical job descriptions to the medical providers so that they can better determine when the injured worker is able to safely return to work without restrictions. Without a job description, the physician has to rely on how well the injured worker described their job activities to them, and it's human nature for some level of exaggeration to occur in that process. So having a physical job description takes all of the guesswork out of the equation for that treating doctor. You might also consider compiling a list of modified duty tasks to have at the ready when an injured worker is assigned physical restrictions. And you can get creative with this. Modified duty offers do not need to be in that worker's regularly assigned department or shift. Be proactive and ask your department heads or management teams for a wish list of tasks that they just could use an extra set of hands for, or hand, depending on the restrictions. And if you are in a jurisdiction that allows you to direct care, you can work with your preferred provider ahead of time to outline your return to work policy and expectations to make sure that your company's specific needs are being met. Let's look at an example of what a physical job description actually looks like. So here we have a modified duty job description. And it also includes a physician sign-off. And including that physician sign-off is a great way to confirm that the potential modified duty activities that are being proposed are safe for that employee to perform. And as I mentioned in the last slide, it can be helpful to proactively create a similar document for the full duty positions within your company. Typical job descriptions often tend to focus on the soft skills needed to perform the job and don't actually include nearly enough detail on the physical requirements. So creating one of these from scratch is a good idea. Now let's look at some ways to mitigate indemnity exposure once an injury does actually occur. So first and foremost, report that injury as soon as you are aware of it, even if it's just a report only or notice only claim. Studies have shown that claims reported within 3 days typically result in lower claim costs on average. And this is because the adjuster can contact the injured worker faster and explain the claims process, reducing the confusion and subsequent litigation that comes with that. They can also perform a more thorough investigation while that information is still fresh. Witness statements are always more impactful if recalling recent events rather than an incident that occurred 6 months ago. Additionally, retroactively investigating a claim, and I know this from experience, can cause some really frustrating ripple effects. It's more difficult to obtain the medical records, which can delay approvals for treatment, which can cause that employee to seek legal representation, so on and so forth. And one of the most important things you can do after an injury occurs is to maintain regular contact with that injured worker. When an injured worker feels valued and cared for by their employer, it makes it so much easier for them to return to work. It's also helpful to reiterate your ability to accommodate restrictions to the employee and their physicians if your jurisdiction allows physician contact. Make sure to place the employee in the appropriate job well within the restrictions whenever possible. And finally, when offering to accommodate restrictions, always do so in writing. If the claim becomes litigated, proof that modified duty work was offered eliminates potential disputes over disability benefits. Sending that written offer via certified mail is another way to cover your bases by generating proof that the employee actually received the offer. I can't tell you how many times as an adjuster I had an injured worker claim that they didn't receive the modified duty job offer when one was sent, and having that proof when the offer was made was needed to make that dispute credibly. Once the employee has returned to modified or transitional duty work, there are even more opportunities to ensure that the claim stays on track. Continue to check in with them regularly. Keep track of their appointment dates and follow up with them after each appointment. This helps keep track of any changes made to the restrictions and makes that employee feel valued. In addition to maintaining contact with the injured worker, it's equally important to maintain contact with the adjuster. This ensures all parties are on the same page and can help identify any potential issues early on. Medical providers can take a few days to send the records to an adjuster, so confirming whether or not you can accommodate the restrictions after each appointment prevents any accidental overpayments from being made. And of course, if the restrictions have changed, make sure to provide an updated, written, modified duty job offer. So I'm willing to bet there are a few of you out there who think, sure, this all sounds great, but implementing a return to work program is easier said than done. So I'd like to get a better idea of what potential obstacles that you all are most concerned about.
All right, so we're going to take another quick poll here just so we can get, like Lacey said, an idea of what all the thoughts are out there. So here we go. So what's your main concern in establishing a formal return to work program? And there are some options there. We'll give you all about 30 to 45 seconds to get this answered, and then we'll see what your thoughts are. All right, we're getting some good responses here. I think they kind of align with what we hear all the time too, Lacey. So we're going to show these results here in just a second. All right, I'll give you all about another 10 seconds. Don't be shy. These are anonymous, I promise. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here, and then we're going to share these results. So let's see. So about 27% of you think that one of the obstacles here, one of the concerns is they're already hurt. What if they get hurt again? We can't pay an employee if they're not doing their normal job. We don't want injured workers talking about their claims at work. That's an important one there too. I think we hear a lot of. And last, our scope of operations is too labor intensive to accommodate restrictions. And that's the biggest percentage, I think, of the concerns out there, which again, aligned with what we say. And luckily, Lacey's got some good information to share with you. So we'll get back to her.
Thanks, Anjali. So, yes, let's talk about all of these concerns. So let's start with concern number 1. What if they get hurt again? So this is a valid concern because, of course, re-injury is always going to be possible. But the benefits often outweigh the risks, especially if you're taking the precautions we discussed in the previous slides. Some other ways to reduce a chance of re-injury are to be thoughtful when you're assigning your modified duty job tasks. Providing a variety of modified duty tasks will help avoid any repetitive use or overcompensation injuries. Slowly progressing their job activities when they change can allow time to condition their body to that increased workload. And you can always place the employee in a supervised setting to make sure that they are complying with those restrictions. So what about concern number 2? We can't pay the employee if they're not performing their regular job. So remember, your experience mod is impacted by lost dollars and lost time claims. Your experience mod impacts your workers' compensation insurance premiums for several years. So what is a lost time claim exactly? A lost time claim is a claim that includes indemnity exposure. There might be multiple types of indemnity benefits that might be owed on a claim. The most common we see is temporary total disability, or TTD, is owed when the injured worker is temporarily unable to return to any type of employment after an injury. And TTD exposure exists for 2 reasons. The primary one being when the doctor provides a work status note taking the worker off of work completely, or when the employer cannot accommodate the restrictions that have been recommended. Temporary partial disability, or TPD, is when the injured worker receives partial payments from both their employer and the insurance carrier. This exposure occurs when accommodating the restrictions results in a reduction of pay or hours worked. So if you found tasks within the restrictions for the injured worker, but you're unable to pay their regular pre-injury wages, they would likely be entitled to temporary partial disability. So while this situation still results in some indemnity payments being issued from the claim, it will always be less than what was owed if we would have paid out temporary total disability. Keep in mind, the closer the injured worker is to earning their average pre-injury pay, the less TPD is owed from the claim. So let's move on to concern number 3. We don't want injured workers talking about their claims at work, and we do hear this quite a bit. So locating appropriate modified duty tasks in different departments or on a different shift can absolutely help reduce concerns of gossip. And there are other benefits to this approach as well. Early in my career, I handled claims for a national hotel chain. And their return to work program specified that they would accommodate any temporary restrictions on their night shift. Or if the restrictions were significant, they would assign the injured worker to sit in the restaurant and fold napkins for the entire shift. So sometimes, and especially when there are concerns about malingering, Slightly inconvenient modified duty job tasks can do wonders to motivate the employees to return to their regular job activities on their normal shift. And keep in mind that in most jurisdictions, refusing a reasonable offer of modified duty work means that no lost time benefits are owed at all. But maybe you're a smaller company and you don't have quite those resources to get that creative. So we're going to go over a non-traditional option in a few slides, but to go over it briefly, there are third-party vendors that can help manage off-site modified duty. And as you can imagine, working off-site makes it pretty difficult for the injured workers to discuss their claims with their coworkers. So finally, concern number 4, which I believe was the most popular answer in our poll, operations are too labor intensive to accommodate restrictions. And this is a common one. This was a common one the last time we did this poll, and it's a common one again. We hear this all the time. Some industries like construction and manufacturing really struggle to accommodate restrictions. Amerisure customers have access to several risk management sources on our customer portal, including OSHA courses. Since our last presentation on this topic, we've seen the OSHA 10-hour and OSHA 30-hour courses, as well as the competent person courses, being used more and more as modified duty work, which is a really creative solution. Because the employee comes into the office to take the course. And so the insured is able to ensure compliance with the restrictions, maintain that regular contact with the injured worker. And in the event permanent restrictions are assigned that can't be accommodated, and we're looking at a wage differential situation where we need to find them new employment, the OSHA courses can open additional possibilities for future employment. Which in turn mitigates the exposures for settlement. And finally, again, this non-traditional option, we're going to talk about it more again in a few slides, like a third-party vendor is always an option. These vendors mostly work for not-for-profit groups like Goodwill or Salvation Army to locate volunteer opportunities within the restrictions. All right, so let's dig into this non-traditional option in more detail. All right, so these vendors use vocational experts to find volunteer work available within the current restrictions. So this gives the employee an opportunity to perform work that is meaningful and provides a sense of purpose while they're in recovery. And you might be wondering, well, how does the employee get paid to do volunteer work? So when utilizing a vendor program, the employer still contributes towards the employee's pay, but the employer decides how much they want to contribute. Now, I've seen employers contribute everything from minimum wage to continuing their full salary. And remember, like I said, the closer the employer contribution is to the pre-injury pay, the less temporary partial disability is owed on the claim. So this option actually gives the employer a little more control over the indemnity exposures and ultimately the experience mod. Much like the OSHA training courses we just talked about, working in a volunteer position can also allow them to acquire new skills and a work history should the restrictions become permanent. It also keeps the injured worker in a routine, which makes that transition back to work much easier. So here are some statistics from Amerisure's preferred traditional return or transitional return to work vendor paradigm. So 90% of paradigm referrals achieve a medical release to return to work. 69% of those referrals successfully return to their pre-injury employer. On average, it takes about 2 days for paradigm to find the transitional work for the injured worker, and then that assignment lasts for about 75 days. So what kind of service can you expect if you're going to utilize a vendor to manage your return to work program? So as I'm sure you can guess, these services are not free. So let's look at what's actually included with these costs. Again, I'm using Paradigm as the example since that's Amerisure's preferred vendor. So Amerisure policyholders are charged a flat rate. And this flat rate includes research for the placement at one transitional work site, ongoing communication between the host site, the employer, and the adjuster for the duration of the assignment. And they also monitor attendance, providing the weekly hours to the adjuster so then the adjuster can issue timely payments if they're owed. So as I mentioned, these vendor services are never free, but let's look at costs in perspective a little bit. Keep in mind that a worker who makes $45,000 a year and has restrictions that cannot be accommodated will receive about $30,000 in TTD benefits during that year, which again impacts your workers' compensation insurance premiums for years. And each vendor is different. Amerisure has negotiated these rates with Paradigm. So Amerisure policyholders will pay nothing if the case is canceled within 24 hours or if the placement was unsuccessful. If the referral is completed within 1 month, our policyholders pay $475. And if the case is open between 2 and 12 months, that flat rate is still only $875. There are several vendors that now provide the service. A few of them are shown here. So if you are not an Amerisure policyholder, I encourage you to reach out to your insurance carrier to see what options they have available for you. All right, so having a robust return to work program, it really is a win-win. So we hope that this presentation provided you with a more in-depth understanding of why return to work programs are so important. And we hope that you're walking away today with some new ideas to improve your existing return to work program if you have one, or if you don't already have a formal program. We hope this presentation kind of gave you the necessary tools to create an effective one.
Right. Thank you so much, Lacey. So we're going to get to our Q&A questions here. We've got a couple in here. If you still have any questions regarding what you heard today, go ahead and enter them in that Q&A box and we'll answer them as we go along. Also, let's see. Well, let's do this first. So 1, will there be a recorded session accessible after the webinar? Absolutely. So we do send this out and I'll talk a little bit about where you can access that a little bit later. So yes, thank you again. 2, second question here. So this one I think is for you, Lacey. So are there other options besides charity work for off-site work? That's a great question.
It really is a great question. And I actually just this week had this come up with an insured that I work with. So there are some other options. One popular one that I know of that I've seen used in the past with the national hotel chain that I handled claims for a while, a large portion of their workforce was non-English speaking. So they actually would send some of their workers to English as a second language courses as the modified duty work. So much like the OSHA courses, much like the transitional return to work off-site, they're gaining skills that not only helps further their career within their current company, but in the event we wind up in a situation where those restrictions are permanent and we can't accommodate that, we have to find this injured worker a new job and pay wage differential. Allowing them to gain these skills is kind of an investment because they're able to find a new job with similar pay, if not more pay, pretty easily, which in turn reduces that exposure for wage differential cases in states where wage differential is a thing.
That's fantastic. And that really is outside the box thinking when it comes to return to work. And not only that, yeah, like you said, it improves safety overall, because if we're all speaking same common language, and we can do our training better, we can do retrainings better, we can do onboarding better. So fantastic option.
And
yeah,
I encourage, if anyone's interested in that, encourage them to just Google English for work. There are several companies that do that allow the employer to monitor the progress and make sure that they're complying with the hours worked. I think Duolingo has one. I think there are some other ones out there. So if you're interested in that, those types of services exist.
Great. And, we, as risk management professionals, we actually do recommend doing training additional training for return to work when the other accommodations can't be made, because again, at the end, it's kind of serving everybody to be able to do that. And what a good time. There's plenty of time there to do it, right? So, okay, I think those were all the questions we had come in. Thanks, Lacey and Blake. I hope you all enjoyed participating in this webinar.